I grew up camping with my parents, so most of the routines came naturally by the time my girlfriend and I planned our overnight on the Loyalsock Trail in May 2018. We picked a primitive site a little past mile marker 36, a small clearing set back from the trail with a flat patch just big enough for a two-person tent and a narrow line of trees to tuck our bear hang out of sight. The weather had been warm during the day, mid-70s, but after the sun went down a thin chill settled into the forest. It was the kind of cold that didn't feel dangerous, just steady and quiet, the kind that made every sound sharper. We reached the clearing a little after 6 in the evening, tired from the steady climb earlier that day. The creek beside the site was running low, only ankle deep in most places, but wide enough to give the area that constant, soft rushing sound that seems to smooth out everything else. We followed the same pattern we always did, pitched the tent, shook out the sleeping bags, hung our food, filtered water. The usual steps, one after another. It was calm, peaceful, predictable. By the time we finished eating and cleaning up, the sky had already dimmed to that deep blue just before full darkness. We turned in around 9, both of us more tired than expected. The trail had been muddy, and the humidity had made each mile feel longer. I remember the weight of the sleeping bag pulling around my shoulders, the sound of the creek mixing with the distant tapping of what I assumed were beetles landing on dead branches. The night felt uneventful in the best way, plain, steady, without anything pushing attention in one direction or another. I drifted in and out of sleep in short stretches, the kind where you sense the difference between real and dream, but don't pay close attention to either. Sometime around 4 in the morning, the fullness of my bladder woke me up with a kind of blunt urgency. It was still fully dark, the kind where the inside of the tent looks like one shadowless mass. The temperature had dropped further, and I could feel the cold pooling around the ground sheet. I reached around for my headlamp, flicked it on, and unzipped the tent just enough to slide out. The zipper made a long, slow rasp that felt louder than anything else at that hour. My girlfriend stirred a little behind me, but settled again almost immediately. Outside, the air smelled like wet leaves and old pine. I clicked the headlamp off before standing upright, mostly out of habit. I liked seeing the night without that harsh white circle in front of me. The stars were faint but visible between the branches. The forest had that hollow pre-dawn stillness, the kind that feels lighter than actual silence, but heavier than still air. I took a few steps away from the tent, moving slowly on the cold soil. That was when I noticed the glow. Through the trees, maybe 200 feet downslope, I saw what looked at first like a campfire. A bright orange pulse, just high enough to be above ground level. It flickered not wildly, but in an uneven rhythm that could easily have been flames shifting with a faint breeze. It was the same color as a small fire built with softwood, warm, steady, inviting. I didn't think much of it at first. People sometimes rolled into camps late, especially on warm weekends, and it wasn't unusual for backpackers to start breakfast early. I stared at it for a few seconds, squinting at the breaks between the trees, trying to make out the silhouette of gear, or a tarp, or even the outline of a person moving around. Nothing stood out. I told myself it didn't matter, handled what I needed to do, and turned back toward the tent. Before climbing back inside, I looked again. Something felt off, though I couldn't place it at first. It took a moment before it clicked. There was no sound. No popping wood, no faint crackle, no shifting coals. Just the quiet, steady glow. I waited for the breeze to change so I could catch the scent of smoke, but there was nothing. The air smelled the same as it had when I stepped out of the tent. Wet leaves, old pine, nothing else. The flickering itself changed, too. It wasn't irregular like a flame reacting to wind. It moved more like a single shape adjusting brightness. A solid circle of orange that brightened and dimmed as if someone were slowly turning a dimmer knob back and forth. It hovered low to the ground, maybe 3 feet up, and didn't throw shadows or light up the surrounding trees in any convincing way. It felt like an object pretending to be a fire, copying just enough of the color to suggest it, but missing the rest. Curiosity pushed me to watch it longer, even though something in my chest tightened in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. After maybe 20 seconds, the glow began to move, not swaying like a lantern being carried, and not drifting like something suspended from a branch. It glided, smoothly, directly, as if on a horizontal track. It passed between 2 close trees in a perfectly straight line. Then it stopped. It had aligned exactly with the direction of our tent. If I drew a straight line from where I stood to the glow, it would pass through the tent's center. The light stayed still for a moment, the brightness leveling out into a steady, unwavering orange. Then, without fading, without dimming, it shut off completely. One instant present, the next absent, like a switch had been thrown. The dark pressed in harder after that. I could hear my pulse in my ears. The air stayed still, without even a hint of warmth or smoke trailing behind. Nothing about the night shifted to mark that anything had happened. I went back into the tent and zipped it behind me, deciding not to wake my girlfriend. I lay on top of my sleeping bag, fully awake now, staring upward though I couldn't see anything. I listened for footsteps, voices, the clatter of cookware, anything that would turn that strange light into something explainable. Nothing drifted through the trees. Just the creek, the insects, the usual night noises. Around 10 minutes later, the sounds changed. The creek, normally a gentle gurgling murmur, suddenly burst with a short, heavy splash. Not the timid dip of an animal testing the waterline, but the full weight of something stepping directly into the deeper pocket near the bank. Another splash followed, rhythmic and spaced exactly like strides. The water shifted as if someone were wading through it in a straight line across the narrowest section. The pattern continued for several steps, deliberate and even. I turned on my headlamp instantly and unzipped the tent halfway, angling the beam toward the creek. The white light cut across the trees and landed on the water. The surface was still, perfectly smooth. No ripples spreading outward, no churned up silt, nothing that suggested movement. The splashing sounds had already stopped, replaced by the unbroken flow of the shallow current. My girlfriend sat up behind me, confused and tired, but neither of us said anything. I didn't want to break the careful quiet that had settled again. We stayed awake until the sky finally lightened, both of us stiff and wired, listening for any other signs of motion. Dawn brought birdsong and a thin, pale gold light through the branches, and with it came a sense of normalcy that felt almost forced. Once we packed up, curiosity pushed me to walk the perimeter of the site. I checked the slope where I'd seen the glow, expecting to find some leftover gear, or maybe a reflective tag on a tree that my half-awake mind had misinterpreted. There was nothing. No campsite, no ash, no footprints, no flattened grass. The ground looked untouched, as if no one had passed through in days. I followed the creek bank too, searching for disturbances in the mud or fresh silt washed onto the rocks. Again, nothing. The water was low and clear, its bed unscarred. We hiked out not long after, both of us quiet for most of the morning. By midday, with the sun warming the trail and the familiarity of the path returning, the sharpness of the night began to blur. The mind fills in gaps with harmless explanations when given enough distance, and bit by bit, it did. I told myself the orange light might have been an illusion caused by another hiker's reflective gear catching moonlight or a distant headlamp bouncing off wet bark. I told myself the splashing might have been a large branch dropping into the water and breaking apart in a way that suggested multiple steps. None of the theories fit perfectly, but they were grounded enough to lean on. What stayed with me most wasn't the glow or the splashes, but the stillness afterward, the way the forest absorbed everything without leaving a mark. It reminded me that in places like that, the mind tries to understand what the senses pick up, even when the environment isn't interested in offering explanations. The night doesn't try to be mysterious. It simply doesn't care what you see or hear. And sometimes, what you think is strange becomes ordinary again the moment the sun comes up, even if a small part of your brain knows the details don't line up cleanly. By the time we reached the next trailhead, the discomfort had settled into something quieter, a memory marked more by cold air and loose soil than anything frightening. But even now, years later, I can still picture the exact color of that glow. Not warm like fire, not bright like a lamp, just a steady orange circle hanging in the dark, copying light without the rest of the world reacting to it. I can still remember the way it moved, perfectly smooth, perfectly straight, as if following something I couldn't see. And even though I came up with explanations that made the most sense and stuck with them, I know I looked long enough to tell the difference between a trick of the forest and something that required more imagination than I usually allow. In the end, the explanation mattered less than the truth that the forest didn't confirm anything at all. It simply stayed quiet, cold, and unchanged, as if the night had swallowed the whole thing and decided not to return a single piece. I spent the first week of June 2016 camping with a small group at a private campground a few miles outside Estes Park. It was one of those places meant to feel rustic without being truly remote. Each campsite had a numbered pad, a worn picnic table, and a gravel pull-off for cars. There was a bathhouse at the center of the loop, warm light leaking from the frosted windows even at night, and a low wooden fence that separated the campground from the thick line of pines at the edge of the property. It was calm, predictable, and ordinary in every way that mattered. I had been there twice before and never seen anything stranger than a raccoon nosing around a fire ring. Our group had 3 tents, but the one I shared with my friend sat farthest from the others, tucked into pad 14 near the trees. We'd chosen it because it offered some shade in the mornings and a bit of privacy from the main gravel road. During the day, the place felt relaxed. Kids rode scooters in circles. Someone always seemed to be grilling. Every hour or so, the same golf cart passed with the campground host checking trash bins or delivering firewood. Nothing about it prepared me for how different the place would feel at 3 in the morning. The night before everything happened, we'd sat around the fire talking until close to midnight. The temperature had dropped sharply, and when I finally climbed into my sleeping bag, the canvas of the tent smelled like dust and pine sap. My phone showed almost no service, but I kept it beside me because I used the flashlight app to navigate to the bathhouse. I remember falling asleep quickly, and I remember nothing else until I woke up to a faint buzz against my hip. The sound felt out of place in the heavy quiet. When I pulled the phone from my bag, the screen flashed once, then went dark. A moment later, it lit again, bright white then dark. It took a few pulses before I understood it wasn't a random flicker. The light came in a pattern of short blinks followed by longer ones, then short again. I knew enough to recognize it as the sequence for an emergency signal. I told myself it had to be a glitch. The service indicator showed nothing, but I still switched the phone into airplane mode just to reset everything. The pattern continued exactly as before, steady and deliberate. I pushed myself upright, trying not to make much noise. The nylon floor rustled anyway, and my friend shifted on the other side of the tent. I could tell she was awake by the way she stopped moving the second I did. I held the phone closer to my face to make sure there wasn't some app or setting I'd turned on by accident. The battery indicator was normal, the temperature wasn't high, and nothing looked corrupted. The blinking carried on in the same repeated rhythm, bright enough to touch every corner of the tent with brief strobe-like flashes. As I tried to think through a rational explanation, condensation affecting the screen, a hardware fault, anything, I noticed a thin sound beneath the wind. It reminded me of someone trying to breathe quietly through tears. Soft, uneven exhales, a damp hitch at the end of each one. The sound drifted from the far side of the tent at first, almost blending into the rustle of branches overhead. I froze, listening. It didn't come from inside. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, close enough that the fabric of the tent seemed to vibrate with each shiver of breath. The sobbing grew clearer, shaped by a voice that sounded strained from crying for a long time. It had the tone of someone maybe in her 30s, worn but not weak. The sound stayed low, almost too faint to identify, like she was trying not to wake anyone nearby. It carried a pleading rhythm, without forming actual words recognizable through the fabric. I could almost picture her posture, shoulders curled forward, hands lifted slightly toward the tent wall. Everything about it hit with a wave of confusion before fear had time to catch up. Nothing made sense. We were in a private campground with assigned pads, well-lit paths, and a host who lived right by the entrance. The sobbing didn't stay in one place. It shifted a few inches at a time, following the length of the tent as if the person were circling slowly. I felt movements in the ground, tiny compressions of dried pine needles and dirt. My skin crawled at the sound of fingernails grazing the seams, soft taps tracing along each zipper as though testing for a weakness. The fabric twitched lightly with each touch. Every muscle in my back pulled tight while I waited for the noise to stop, but it didn't. It kept drifting around us in a slow path, stopping occasionally just long enough for the air to thicken with expectation. I didn't speak. I didn't even breathe properly. My friend rustled once beside me, barely audible, but enough to confirm she was fully awake and trying just as hard to stay silent. The atmosphere inside the tent grew hot and still. My heartbeat felt louder than the wind. I considered unzipping the flap, but every instinct warned against it. The shape of the situation was wrong. This wasn't a lost hiker wandering in by mistake. The footsteps were too controlled. The sobbing was too focused on the tent itself, not the surroundings. After a long stretch of that circling, my friend moved just enough that I sensed her eyes on me through the darkness. She wanted me to respond somehow, to take action because I was the one sitting upright. I didn't want to, but I knew the hesitation was making everything worse. I forced myself to break the silence. The sound of my voice came out sharper than intended, cutting through the air with a steadiness that surprised both of us. The reaction was immediate. The sobbing stopped mid-breath, like a faucet turned off. No fading, no hitch, just an instant withdrawal. Then the footsteps retreated in a straight line toward the trees, fast but not panicked, as if the person already knew exactly where to go. I listened until the last faint crunch of branches faded into the deeper forest. My phone screen went dark and stayed that way, no more blinking, no buzzing. The quiet returned in full. We didn't sleep again. We didn't unzip the tent until the sky turned pale. When we stepped outside at sunrise, everything looked untouched. No footprints showed clearly in the pine needles, but that wasn't unusual. The ground was too thick with natural debris to retain detail. The campsite felt ordinary again, the same picnic table, the same cooler, the same early morning birdsong. It was almost possible to pretend the night had been a strange half-dream until I checked my phone. At 3:27 a.m., 3 minutes before I had woken, a new note had been added to my notes app. I hadn't opened that app in days. The line of text was short and plain, typed with perfect spelling and no punctuation beyond a final period. The timestamp matched the moment the blinking must have started. The message said only that I had heard her, phrased in a way that felt less like a statement and more like a reminder of something I had failed to do. I showed the campground host the note, because I didn't know what else to do. He scanned the reservation board and the check-in sheet, then walked the loop with us to confirm the neighboring sites had remained empty all night. He mentioned that sometimes people wandered in from the highway or the trailheads if they were lost, but even he admitted that most of them went straight to the bathhouse or tried the first occupied tent they saw. It didn't make sense for anyone to choose a tent partly hidden behind trees, ignore the occupied sites closer to the road, and then leave without going near the lights of the central building. Later that afternoon, I tried to reconstruct the pattern of events to calm myself. My phone could have glitched. The sobbing could have come from someone disoriented or in some kind of emotional crisis. The person might have been checking the tent seams because she thought someone inside could help her. The message in the Notes app could have been typed accidentally if the phone activated in my sleeping bag, though the phrasing was too deliberate. None of these explanations fit perfectly, but they were at least rooted in real possibilities. Looking back, the most reasonable conclusion is that someone in distress entered the campground from the woods, probably without realizing which sites were occupied. She might have had a reason to avoid the main road or the bathhouse lights, a reason I'll never know. Maybe she tried to get my attention with the blinking light and the scraping because she didn't trust her own voice. Maybe my shout startled her into running before she could explain herself. And maybe the note was her attempt to leave a sign that she'd been trying to communicate all along. The part that stays with me is not the fear but the uncertainty. Everything that happened had a plausible, human explanation, but each explanation carried a weight I didn't feel prepared for at the time. I still think about the steady rhythm of the footsteps, the controlled way she moved around the tent, and the instant silence after I spoke. There was no supernatural element to any of it, only a person, close enough to touch, trying to be heard in the middle of the night. In October 2017, I was backpacking in Big Bend National Park, following the outer mountain loop the way most people tackle it. Clockwise, carrying nearly all my water, moving slow under the weight, and trying to beat the heat each day by starting early. That first night I camped near Fresno Creek, at a flat patch of gravel and scrub I picked because it had a bit of shelter from the wind and a decent view of the wash below. I marked my camp on my map at 6:48 p.m., more out of habit than necessity, then settled in to cook. By the time I rinsed out my pot and walked 20 yards from camp to look for a spot to hang my food bag, the stars had already begun to push through the last of the twilight. Big Bend always had that effect. Darkness seemed to fall faster and deeper than anywhere else I'd ever hiked. I climbed into my tent early, partly because I had miles to make in the morning, and partly because there was nothing else to do. The stillness out there had a way of pressing in once the sun went down. Even the creek beside me had only a faint trickle to it. I remember checking the time a few minutes before I fell asleep. My watch glowed 8:31 p.m., and the air coming through the mesh felt cool and clean, the kind that made the nylon walls gently pulse. The sound that woke me sometime after midnight didn't jolt me upright. It eased me awake the way a distant engine might drift into awareness. At first it was only a vague impression of movement, a soft shift in the background noise. I lay still inside my sleeping bag, listening. The desert has its own language at night, wind flattening through creosote, small animals testing the edge of camp, the occasional rustle of dry stalks settling. None of that bothered me. I'd backpacked enough to know normal nighttime rhythms. But then I heard it again, something longer, drawn out in a way natural sounds usually aren't. It carried through the wash, thin but unmistakably human. It wasn't shouting, not even calling with any sense of urgency. It just rose out of the dark and settled over the creek bed like a question spoken into an empty hallway. I unzipped my bag, sat up, and reached for my headlamp. The notion that someone else might be out there didn't strike me as strange at first. People occasionally hike sections of the loop at odd hours, especially if they miscalculate water or pace. Still, night hiking in that area wasn't common. The terrain was too rocky, the distances too deceptive. I clicked on the lamp and pushed myself out of the tent. The beam stabbed through the brush, cutting through mesquite branches and low clumps of prickly pear. I expected to catch the reflection of an emergency blanket or the faint glint of gear. Instead, all I saw was the stillness of the wash, undisturbed in every direction. The sound came again. It floated in from somewhere ahead of me, closer than before but carrying the same flat, almost practiced tone. There was something odd in how consistent it sounded, as if the pitch never wavered. No hint of cold, no fatigue, just the same calm, steady level cadence. I stepped a few feet away from my tent, bracing my boots against the loose gravel. I didn't know if the person was injured, disoriented, or simply trying to find another hiker's camp. But the uniformity of the voice, the way it didn't shift even slightly, held my attention more than anything else. I angled my light toward the bushes lining the wash. Some of the branches shivered as though something had brushed against them, but nothing came into view. The air carried no sense of movement, no crunch of boots or scrape of fabric, just the faint stirring of leaves. The strange part was how the sound drifted. It wasn't stationary. It shifted positions in small increments, like someone moving along an uneven path, but always out of sight. Each call landed the same way, as if released from the same starting point in the speaker's throat. I tried to answer, making my own voice clear and steady, hoping whoever it was would respond with something different, something that acknowledged my words. Instead, the call repeated, untouched by anything I'd said. I kept my light sweeping the wash. Sometimes I thought I caught a flicker of motion, a branch bouncing back, a rock reflecting a fraction of my beam, but nothing human ever resolved out of the shapes and shadows. I checked my watch at one point. It had been 15 minutes since I first stepped out of the tent. My breath had settled into a tight rhythm, not quite fear, but tension. I realized I didn't actually know how many ways sound could behave in terrain like that. The wash created strange corridors. The canyon walls bounced noise in irregular patterns. Distances became slippery. The night exaggerated everything. Then the sound cut off. Not tapered, not faded, just stopped in the middle of whatever syllable was forming. The sudden absence felt heavier than the noise itself had. Even the insects seemed to pause. I held my breath and waited for it to start again, or for some other sign to pick up the trail, a footstep, a cough, anything. But the desert went still, the kind of stillness that settled with certainty instead of suspense. I stood there a long moment before backing toward my tent. The beam of my headlamp started to look too narrow, too weak against the reach of the dark. I returned to the tent, zipped it closed, and lay inside with my eyes open even though the fabric above me gave me nothing to look at. The rest of the night passed without another sound. In the morning the creek bed looked the same as ever. No footprints other than my own. No broken branches, no discarded gear, no signs of someone stumbling through the brush. I tried to reason it out logically. Big Bend was huge, remote, and often deceptive with distances. Sound could have traveled farther than it seemed. I forced myself to pack at my normal pace, eat breakfast, and continue toward my next waypoint. Later that afternoon, when I reached Panther Junction to refill water and check in with a ranger about conditions on the next section, I mentioned the voice in passing. I didn't dramatize it. I kept my explanation straightforward, listing the time, approximate location, and what I thought I'd heard. The ranger's reaction wasn't what I expected. His expression tightened around the jaw. He listened but didn't ask for clarification or details. When I finished, he simply said that if I heard anything like that again at night, I should stay where I was. People got turned around out there. Sound traveled strangely in the basins. Wandering toward noises in the dark could be dangerous. He didn't mention search operations or hikers known to call for help. He just nodded once and closed the subject. Something about that reaction stayed with me. It wasn't fear or alarm, but it wasn't casual either. It felt like he'd heard similar accounts before and didn't want to dwell on them. When I got home a few days later, curiosity pushed me to check missing person reports tied to the Outer Mountain Loop. I found one from 2013 about a woman who had vanished without a confirmed location, last seen near the start of the same loop. The online summary noted her age, late 20s. I remembered thinking that the voice I'd heard sounded like someone in that range. The report listed her first name. It matched the impression I'd had in the dark, the faint suggestion buried between echoes and distance. I didn't come away with any supernatural conclusion. What I heard could have been an echo from farther off than I realized, someone hiking a parallel ridge or cutting across the wash in the night. The uniform tone could have come from wind patterns distorting the natural rise and fall of a person's voice. The movement might have been nothing more than tricks of terrain and shadow. And the missing woman's case, tragic as it was, didn't have to be connected to what I heard. But the detail that stuck with me was how sound in the desert seemed capable of peeling itself apart from its source, drifting and reshaping until it felt unanchored, wandering on its own path. What I'd heard wasn't impossible or unnatural. It just didn't behave the way my instincts expected a human voice to behave. That gap, the space between expectation and reality, was what unnerved me. Even now, when I think back on that night, the part that rises first isn't the voice itself. It's the clean stop of it, the way everything fell silent in an instant, like the desert swallowed the last trace of sound before it could reach me. I can explain almost every element of that experience with wind, topography, and distance. But the sudden cutoff is what returns in memory, sharp and decisive, as if the desert itself had control over when the night's sounds were allowed to begin and when they had to end. I remember the exact color of the light when we first settled in that evening, the way the air turned from warm gold to a sort of bluish gray as the sun dropped behind the jagged ridge. By 7:15 p.m., our small camp along Rock Creek in the Beartooth Mountains felt almost too peaceful to take seriously. The water ran low and constant beside us, carrying a cold smell that drifted into every part of the clearing. We were at least half a mile from the main trail, tucked behind a cluster of pines that broke the wind and kept us out of sight of anyone moving through the area. It was supposed to be one of those nights where the quiet felt earned and safe, the kind that makes you believe you've left the rest of the world behind. My cousin and I pitched our tents roughly 10 meters apart, a little staggered so each one faced a different part of the clearing. The fire ring someone had built earlier in the season still held bits of charcoal and a bent grate. We placed our bare canisters about 15 paces from the tents, far enough for safety, but close enough that I could glance over and reassure myself they were upright. The air cooled quickly after sunset, and the creek noise blended with the faint rustle of needles above us. When darkness finally settled in, it came heavy and complete, the kind that forces your eyes to adjust for minutes before shapes begin to exist again. I remember crawling into my sleeping bag with that particular tiredness that only comes from climbing all day. My legs hummed from the effort, and the thin mountain air felt almost sweet when I took slow breaths. The last thing I noticed before drifting off was the faint glow of my cousin's headlamp flickering inside his tent as he sorted gear. Eventually even that blinked out, leaving only the quiet and the sound of water. Sometime around midnight, though I wouldn't learn the exact time until later, I woke to a muted thump followed by a hollow rolling sound. At first it blended with the creak in my half-asleep brain, but then the sound continued in short, uneven bumps, as though something heavy was shifting across the dirt. It took a full second for recognition to snap awake inside me. It was the bare canister. It wasn't supposed to move unless something pushed it. I lifted my head, listening hard. The night had that tight, brittle stillness to it, the kind that seems to press against your ears. No wind. No insects. Just the rolling thud of plastic against soil. My heartbeat kicked up fast, not panicked yet, but alert in the way I always hoped I'd be if something like this happened. I slid one hand toward my headlamp and clicked it on, keeping the beam low as I unzipped the tent door a few centimeters. Cold air seeped in. When I eased the fabric open enough for the light to reach outside, I expected to see the round hulk of a bear, or, at the very least, some other animal nosing around. Instead, the light caught the pale line of the fire ring stones and something kneeling beside them. A human shape. A man. He crouched low with his back partly toward me, his entire posture strange and bent, as if he were inspecting some tiny detail in the dirt. My first reaction wasn't fear. It was disbelief, the immediate refusal to accept that anyone else should be here, let alone at this hour, let alone like this. He wore a tan hoodie so dirty it looked more gray than brown, with dark patches on the sleeves and back that could have been mud or old stains of something else. His hair stuck out in stiff clumps beneath the hood, and in one of his hands he held one of our metal mugs. It dangled loosely from his fingers, catching my beam just enough to give off a dull shine. Our food bags lay open behind him, spilled like someone had gone through them piece by piece. When the light touched his face, he turned his head in an unnaturally slow movement, as if he had already known I was there and simply decided it was time to acknowledge me. His eyes didn't squint or flinch from the brightness the way most people's would. They stayed wide and flat, reflecting the beam back at me in a way that made them look almost glassy. I froze completely, still half lying in my sleeping bag with only my arm and head outside the tent. For a moment he didn't move at all. His gaze locked on me with a focus that felt intrusive, like he was trying to look past the light and into the tent itself. His mouth hung slightly open, not enough to make an expression, just enough to look wrong. I felt an immediate surge of heat in my chest, the unmistakable burst of instinct telling me that nothing about this situation made sense, that this wasn't a normal encounter with a lost backpacker or a curious passerby. Before I could think of what to do, he lifted one arm slowly and extended it, pointing not at me but toward the trees behind my cousin's tent. His hand hovered there for half a second, shaking faintly as though the muscles couldn't hold the position. I couldn't see what he intended to indicate. Nothing moved in that direction, no shadow or shape stood out. I only heard the same quiet and the same creak. Every part of me wanted to shout for my cousin, but my throat felt tight. The moment stretched long enough for adrenaline to finally crash through the paralysis. I managed to force out his name, loud and sharp in the stillness, breaking the tension as if snapping a rope. The man reacted with a suddenness that made me jerk backward. He didn't stumble or pivot. He bolted straight into the dark, moving fast and low, like someone practiced at slipping through trees without making noise. The only sound he made was the quick patter of his footsteps and the soft swish of branches brushing his clothes. Then he was gone into the black. My cousin scrambled out of his tent within seconds, confused and asking if something was wrong, but I was already stuffing gear into my pack with frantic hands. The canister lay on its side, our food half spilled out, the mug dropped near the fire ring. Neither of us wasted time gathering everything neatly. We packed by headlamp, each motion jerky and urgent, trying to compress the whole camp into our packs in under 10 minutes. The darkness around us felt different now, too thick and too aware. As soon as we had everything, we switched off our lamps and turned them back on only in short bursts while following the GPS track back toward the trail. The forest felt alive in the worst way, every sound behind us amplified, every shift of branches hinting at movement. About a quarter mile into the hike, we began hearing distinct snaps behind us, branches breaking under weight, not the soft settling sounds of a calm forest. They came intermittently, sometimes close enough that I felt a jolt of cold run down my arms. Each time we paused to listen, the sounds stopped completely. We quickened our pace, stepping over roots and rocks with a kind of clumsy urgency, glancing back more times than I can count. The snapping followed us for at least a mile. Sometimes it sounded a little to the left, sometimes directly behind, as though something was pacing us but keeping just out of the reach of our lights. Only when the elevation began to drop and the trail widened near the creek crossing did the sounds fade. Not gradually, but all at once, leaving only our breathing and the creaking straps of our packs. We didn't stop until we reached the car at the trailhead, pushing through the remaining distance with a tension that didn't ease even when the first hint of dawn began spreading a thin blue glow over the peaks. When the engine finally turned over and the headlights washed across the empty parking area, the relief hit hard enough that I had to sit still for a moment before driving. I've camped in remote places for years. I've dealt with wildlife, storms, even the unsettling loneliness that sometimes creeps in when the wilderness presses close. But nothing has stayed with me the way that night has. There was no mystery about what happened. No supernatural explanation to wonder about. Just a man, somewhere out there far from any reasonable route, going through our things in the middle of the night, standing still under my light with eyes that didn't react the way they should have, and moving with a quiet that didn't match the way a person normally flees. We told ourselves later that he was probably transient or unstable, maybe high, maybe desperate, maybe lost. Those were the simplest ways to explain his presence. But the truth is, None of those explanations quite fit the way he behaved, the way he pointed into the trees, the way he followed us just far enough to keep pace without trying to get close. I still think about the direction he pointed. I never saw anything there, never heard anything besides him. But sometimes, when I go over the memory in the way people do, when they try to file something into a box that makes sense, I feel a chill that has nothing to do with the cold that night. Whatever he meant, whatever reason he had for being out there and going through our camp, it was enough to make two grown adults tear down a campsite in minutes and hike miles in darkness without stopping. And whenever I'm alone in the mountains now, no matter how familiar the trail or how calm the night, I always place my bear canister just a little farther away than needed. I always check it twice, and I always wake instantly at the smallest sound of something rolling in the dark. I had been to Lake Kachuma a few times before, but March 2019 was the first time my friends and I decided to stay at one of the outer spots, the ones tucked close to the thicker trees where the campground lights fade out early. We picked B26 because it was far enough from the RV cluster to feel like real camping, but still close to the loop road, so we could unload without dragging gear across half the park. The air that evening carried that early spring chill that comes right after sunset in the valley, sharp enough to sting a bit when you breathe too fast. The lake smell drifted in from the west. Cold water, wet dirt, and that faint mineral scent that only shows up when the wind comes in low. By late evening, the campground had settled. Most families had turned in, and the remaining conversations had dropped to quiet murmurs or died out entirely. We were spread around the fire with our chairs angled toward the heat. The flames made the nearby trunks glow and left everything past them in layered darkness. I remember feeling content, tired in that pleasant way that comes after driving all afternoon and unloading coolers and tents without rushing. Around 11:40 p.m., something shifted so abruptly that all of us straightened in our chairs at the same moment. The wind, which had been brushing lightly across the treetops, just stopped. The branches went still in a way that felt staged, like someone had pressed mute on the entire campground. No crickets, no distant hum of the highway. Not even the soft flap of the nylon tent walls behind us. Silence layered itself over everything, and the fire crackled louder than it should have. Right after that silence settled, we heard footsteps on the gravel loop road. Not quick ones, not the loose, light steps of another camper heading to the bathroom, but slow, heavy ones. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The gravel on that loop had a very specific sound, coarse, uneven, loud when you put weight on it. These steps sounded like someone pacing without any intention of being quiet. Each one was deliberate, evenly spaced, and close enough that it was clear the person was right on the road behind my chair, just outside the full reach of the firelight. I turned around, expecting a ranger doing a late check. In that split second before I moved, I pictured the reflective badge, the flashlight angled down, the park jacket. But when I twisted in my seat and looked toward the loop, there was nothing but a faint line of gravel across the darkness. If anyone had been there, even without a flashlight, I would have at least seen the shape of shoulders or a head blocking the glow from the campsite behind us. There was nothing. Before I could convince myself that maybe the footsteps had come from farther away than they sounded, the crunching started again. This time it felt like it came from the opposite side of the campsite, near the picnic table. The direction didn't make sense. No one could have crossed that ground without us hearing brush or leaves, and the firelight covered that angle well enough that any person would have been visible. I grabbed one of the flashlights from the ground and swept it toward the noise. The beam hit the table, the bare box, the cluster of trees behind them, and nothing else. The sound stopped instantly, as if whoever, or whatever, was moving had frozen at the same time the light appeared. When I lowered the light, the crunching started again, now from behind the tents, farther back in the darker patch of trees. At first, it felt like the direction changes were logical. Sound can shift in the dark, especially around trees. But after a few more rounds of us moving the flashlight and the footsteps responding by jumping to a new location, the pattern became too sharp, too synchronized. It wasn't echo or wildlife. It was like someone was intentionally staying out of sight and circling the exact perimeter of the fire's reach. Always close, always just beyond whatever angle we were checking. The circling went on long enough for every second to stretch and settle into my nerves. 10 full minutes. Long enough that my sense of distance and timing warped. I kept glancing at the tree line behind the tents, waiting to see movement, waiting to catch even a faint outline of a person. Nothing ever appeared, but the steady rhythm of those footsteps kept looping around us like a slow, deliberate inspection. The air felt heavier during that time. I remember noticing the temperature more than before, as if the lack of wind made the cold air press right against my skin. The fire's warmth didn't seem to reach as far as usual. I kept listening for any other sound, anything that would break the cycle of gravel crunching, but the campground stayed unnaturally still. The moment that broke everything wasn't another footstep. It came from behind us, from inside my tent. A faint, unmistakable sound. The slow, careful slide of a zipper being moved by deliberate hands. Not jerky, not stuck, not wind-driven. A smooth, intentional pull. My tent's door was fully closed and clipped. I knew it. I had zipped it shut earlier and secured the little toggle so it wouldn't drift open. That quiet rasp of the zipper came from the exact height of the door, not from the top vent or the sides. I didn't think. My body moved on its own. I bolted from my chair, crossed the campsite in a few long strides, and yanked the flap open with more force than I meant to. The nylon popped as it hit the side of the tent. Inside, the sleeping bag I had rolled earlier was now spread out perfectly flat, like someone had smoothed it by hand. My headlamp, buried deep in the bag when I left it, was sitting neatly on the pillow, turned on, its beam pointed directly at the entrance I had just opened. The tent smelled different too. Not bad, not like sweat or anything obvious. Just slightly wrong, as if the air inside had been disturbed by someone who had been sitting or crouching there a moment before. I stood there with the flashlight shaking in my hand, trying to figure out how anyone could have gotten inside without unzipping the door. The only explanation was that the door had been opened and closed so quietly earlier that we hadn't heard it over the fire. But that didn't sit right. Nylon zippers aren't silent, and there had been no wind to mask the sound. The small stakes on the corners were still tight in the soil, which meant the tent hadn't been shifted or pressed in from the outside. The more I examined the scene, the more the details added up in a way that tightened my chest. The headlamp wasn't just placed on the pillow, it was angled precisely toward the doorway. The sleeping bag wasn't tossed or moved around. It was laid out the way you'd prepare it if you were about to lie down. Nothing else was touched. My clothes, the stuffed sacks, the small pouch of toiletries at the back, everything was exactly where I had left it. The only thing that made sense, even if it felt deeply unsettling, was that someone had been watching us long before we heard the footsteps. Someone had approached while we were distracted by the fire, opened the tent quietly enough to go unnoticed, searched just enough to find the headlamp, arranged the sleeping bag in a way that made it clear the intrusion was personal, and left without making a sound until they stepped back onto the gravel loop. The footsteps circling us afterward weren't random. They were deliberate, the movement of a person waiting for us to notice something without giving themselves away. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. We kept the fire going until dawn and packed the gear as soon as there was light. When we looked around in the morning, the gravel on the loop road showed faint depressions, too smudged to trace, but spaced in a way that matched someone walking slowly. There were no tracks leading to or from the tent, which meant the person had approached from the tree line where the ground was covered in pine needles soft enough to hide anything. The rangers told us later that sometimes people wander the park at night, unstable hikers, trespassers from the highway, even the occasional person who sneaks into the grounds without paying. They said it happens more often than visitors realize. That explanation made sense. It also landed heavily, because it meant the most unsettling part wasn't the footsteps or the silence or even the sleeping bag. It was the idea that someone had been close enough to watch us, to move around our things, to slip out of sight every time we turned a light toward them. Someone who knew the exact edges of firelight and shadow. Someone patient enough to circle for 10 minutes without making a mistake. Someone who could have stepped 1 foot farther into the light at any moment, and we would have seen a face instead of darkness. I set up camp later than I meant to that evening, sometime just after 6. I remember noting the exact time in my little spiral notebook, 6:02 p.m., and writing down my location so I could match it up with the next day's hike. I had stopped in a small clearing about a mile and a half south of County Road M. It wasn't an official campsite, just a flat patch of ground slightly tucked back from the Ice Age trail. The temperature had dropped enough that my breath showed when I leaned over my stove. The woods around me were still and a little too quiet, the kind of quiet that only settles in after a long day of walking. The air had that damp, early fall smell, cold earth, leaves just beginning to rot, a sweetness from pine needles crushed under my boots. I'd picked the clearing because it looked protected. A few tall pines formed a natural wall on one side, and the trail was only a few steps away. I could hear a small creek not far off, hidden behind a thin screen of brush. There were no signs of recent human activity. No fire rings, no boot tracks, no trash. I liked that. Solitude felt like a luxury after months of being indoors too much. I cooked a simple dinner, rice and a pouch of vegetables, then sat on a fallen log until the sky dimmed so fully that the shapes of trees were just darker versions of the night. When I finally crawled into my tent, the air had grown cool enough that I had to zip my sleeping bag all the way up. I fell asleep easily. Long hikes usually did that to me. What woke me wasn't anything dramatic at first. It was a faint crunching sound, so soft it blended into my dream until a sharper crack, a rock shifting under weight, pulled me fully awake. I lay on my back, eyes open in the dark, listening. At first I thought it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon, something small. My mind tried to settle on that explanation, but the sounds kept coming, steady, deliberate, too rhythmic for anything four-legged. The crunching grew louder. Gravel, or something like it, grinding under weight. But there was no gravel anywhere near me. The trail was packed dirt covered in leaves. The nearest road was far enough away that I shouldn't have been able to hear a car, even if one was passing by. I remember staring at the nylon ceiling of my tent, my breathing frozen halfway in my throat, trying to make sense of a sound that didn't belong in that place. Then everything stopped. The night became completely still, so silent it felt unnatural, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I could feel my heartbeat thudding against my ribs. I waited for an explanation, a gust of wind, a branch falling, anything, but there was nothing. A single, short metallic click broke the silence. It was unmistakable, a car door opening. For a moment I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was my sleeping bag's zipper shifting under me. Maybe a branch had snapped in a strange way. I wanted any explanation except the one forming in my head, because a car door meant a vehicle, and there was no vehicle. The forest around me was dense, uneven, full of roots and brush. No headlights shone through the trees. No engine hummed. No air moved the way it does when a heavy object rolls to a stop. I didn't move, not even a finger. My sleeping bag felt suddenly too tight, like it trapped me in place. The air inside the tent grew hot from my own fear. Then I heard footsteps, slow and heavy, coming from the right side of the tent. Not cautious animal footsteps. Human ones. Leaves crushed under a heel. Soil compacted under weight. I could feel each one in my chest. They stopped so close to the tent wall, I could sense the presence of a body just beyond the thin layer of fabric. My breath was shaking so badly I had to force myself to take shallow, controlled pulls of air. I could hear something else too, another person farther back. Their steps were uneven, as if they were pulling something that didn't want to move. I didn't hear voices in the sense of tone or conversation, just the low, muffled rhythm of one person speaking close to where I lay, giving direction to someone else. The words weren't fully clear, more like a low murmur that carried enough shape that my mind filled in what was missing. I didn't want to hear more. I didn't want to understand any detail they might be saying about distance or location or choice. My body went rigid, every muscle locked. The dragging sound got louder. Something heavy, scraping over roots and leaves, bumping occasionally against something solid. It was slow, uneven, the way a large weight moves when the person pulling it is tired or working against ground that doesn't want to give. The steps circled my tent, close enough that I could track each footfall by sound alone. My throat felt raw from holding my breath. Eventually the footsteps moved away from me, deeper into the woods behind the clearing. The dragging sound faded with them. I lay still, unable to move, listening as the forest swallowed them. Even when the sounds were gone, I didn't trust silence. I kept imagining someone standing just out of reach, watching, waiting for the slightest rustle from inside the tent. The hours between then and dawn stretched endlessly. My legs cramped. My fingers tingled. I didn't shift my weight or adjust my sleeping bag. I barely let myself blink. Every tiny sound, the creak of a tree, the distant splash from the creek, the ticking of my own cooling stove out in the clearing, felt like a threat. I kept replaying what I had heard, trying to fit it into something harmless. Maybe night hikers. Maybe other campers who had lost the trail. But those explanations fell apart as soon as I considered the details. Night hikers don't move heavy objects through dense woods in total darkness. They don't open car doors where cars can't be. When dawn finally came, the light seemed weak at first, like it didn't want to touch the forest floor. My tent's fabric shifted from black to gray. Only then did I let myself move. My hands were stiff, tingling with pins and needles. I pushed myself upright slowly, half expecting to hear footsteps rushing back. I unzipped the tent with shaking fingers. The clearing looked unchanged at a glance. My stove sat where I had left it. My food bag was still tied to the tree. But when I stepped outside, the ground told a different story. Parallel drag marks cut straight across the trail, deep enough to expose the darker soil beneath the leaf litter. They were fresh, too fresh to have been made by anything natural. The boot prints beside them were sharp, crisp-edged, the tread pattern clear enough that I could see the shape of each ridge. Some prints overlapped my own from the day before. They led from the right side of my tent, looped around it, then headed into the woods exactly where I had heard the sounds disappear. There were no tire tracks, no flattened grass, no disturbance that could explain the car door click. The forest floor beyond the clearing was too uneven for any vehicle, yet the marks and footprints were undeniable. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself I was misreading what I saw. But the evidence didn't change when I blinked or stepped back or crouched down for a closer look. Something or someone had been moving through those woods in the middle of the night with a heavy load and a strange, silent efficiency that made no sense. I packed up quickly, hands shaking so hard I dropped the tent poles twice. I didn't eat. I didn't take more notes. I walked the entire distance back to County Road M without stopping to rest, turning around every few seconds, half expecting to see someone following the same trail of prints. I didn't see anyone, but near the trail junction, just before the trees thinned, I found one last boot print, pressed deep into the soft dirt and pointing in the same direction I was heading, as if someone had stood there long enough to shift their weight and sink the tread. It was fresh, too fresh to be from the night before. I didn't linger. I stepped past it and kept walking until the trees gave way to open road and bright sun. Only then did the forest finally feel far enough behind me that I could breathe normally again. I never went back to that section of trail, and I haven't camped alone since. I took my younger brother camping at Deception Pass State Park in August of 2022, choosing a primitive site off the Goose Rock Perimeter Trail because it was just far enough from the regular loops to feel quiet. The walk-in was about 25 minutes, most of it under tall firs that blocked out the sky except for broken streaks of late summer light. The air had that smell of sun-warmed salt and dry needles that always hangs around the north end of Whidbey Island, and he seemed relaxed during the hike, kicking at cones and asking about the tide schedule, the usual things he fussed over when he was trying to be helpful. I remember thinking the site felt more remote than it actually was, tucked a little above the shoreline with only a faint gap in the trees where you could hear the water pushing against the rocks below. We set up the tent on a patch of flattened soil where someone else had clearly camped earlier in the season. The ground held the heat from the day, and when we crawled inside after dinner, it felt soft and warm. Through the mesh I could see a few streaks of distant headlights passing across the bridge, but the sound barely reached us. My brother shifted around for a long time before he finally settled. He had always been a restless sleeper, even as a kid, and I assumed the uneven ground and the faint slosh of water were keeping him awake. I fell asleep quickly. I remember turning once, maybe twice, thinking the night felt unusually still. It must have been after 3 when I woke, because the first thing I saw on my watch was 3:17 glowing weakly in the dark. What woke me wasn't any sudden noise, just a soft, steady sound that took me a moment to place. It was my brother's voice, low and muffled, carrying through the walls of the tent like he was half performing a phone call. I thought he must have woken early and stepped outside to get service, though that made no sense because we were buried under trees and he almost never made calls that late. The sound didn't match anything I recognized. He wasn't talking the way he normally did when he was tired or rambling. The tone was flatter, spaced out, like he was responding to long pauses from someone I couldn't hear. I reached across the tent, expecting to bump into him or at least feel the shape of his sleeping bag, but all I touched was cold fabric. His bag lay open and empty, smoothed in a way that told me he had gotten up some time earlier, not just a minute before. The chill of it made my stomach lurch. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and stepped out barefoot onto the cool dirt. The forest around us looked deeper than before, like the night had thickened. My brother's voice drifted faintly from uphill, in the direction of the ridgeline that curved toward the water. I grabbed my flashlight and called his name, not loudly, but firmly enough that he should have reacted if he had been awake. Nothing changed. The muttering carried on in that same steady rhythm, as if he hadn't heard me. The trail that climbed above our site wasn't an official one, just a thin path created by people wandering toward viewpoints over the water. I followed it, brushing past huckleberry branches that slapped quietly against my legs. The flashlight beam jittered over tree trunks and clumps of ferns. Every so often it caught a patch of pale bark that made me think someone was standing there. The whole time I could hear him ahead, the sound rising and falling with the slope of the land. At one point it even sounded like he paused, then answered something, and the space between his words felt wrong, like somebody else should have been filling it. When I reached the top of the hill, the ground narrowed into a ledge of packed dirt overlooking the channel. The water below moved with a slow, heavy sound, deep enough that it didn't break sharply against the rock. My flashlight beam swept across the slope until it hit him. He stood barefoot near the edge, toes almost hanging over the drop, shoulders slightly hunched. His eyes were half-lidded in that unfocused way that people look when they're trying to wake up from a dream but haven't fully returned. His lips moved steadily, forming words I couldn't catch. A few feet in front of him, there was a gap between two huge boulders that slanted down toward the dark water. The space looked like a crude doorway, wide at the top and narrowing into shadow. Nothing occupied it. There was no person, no animal, not even a shifting of leaves. But the moment my light touched that gap, I heard something that froze me in place. It wasn't a voice exactly, more like the low, indistinct sound of someone murmuring a foot or two away from him. The tone carried the shape of speech without any clear words. My brother's shoulders tightened each time that murmur rose, as if he was listening and responding. I stepped toward him and placed a hand on his shoulder, expecting him to jolt awake or pull away. Instead he went completely rigid, like every muscle locked at once. He didn't turn to me, didn't blink, just stiffened with a strange, delayed recognition that made the hair on my arms lift. His muttering stopped. His breathing shifted into a slow, mechanical pattern that didn't sound like him at all. In that moment, he produced a sentence, flat, wrong in its cadence, nothing like his voice. He said something about not being from here, but without any of the confusion or emotion you would expect from someone speaking in their sleep. The words came out controlled, steady, and they didn't feel like they belonged to him. A second later he blinked rapidly, as if something had been pulled away from his eyes, and his knees buckled. I grabbed his arm before he toppled sideways over the edge. He sagged against me, breathing hard, staring around with no understanding of where we were. His feet were filthy from the climb, the soles scraped and covered with grit. When I asked if he was hurt, he didn't answer at first. He kept looking toward the water like he expected to find someone standing there. Eventually he whispered that the last thing he remembered was falling asleep in the tent. He couldn't recall walking out, couldn't recall the path, and he definitely couldn't explain why he had been standing on a ledge above moving water in the middle of the night. I kept a hand on his arm as we walked back to camp. The forest felt louder on the way down. The brushing of branches, the pulse of the tide, the faint tick of pebbles shifting under our steps. Every few yards he glanced behind us. I tried to keep my flashlight steady, but my hand shook enough to make the beam tremble across the ground. Back at the tent, he sat down without speaking. I checked his feet, wiped off the dirt with the edge of a towel, and zipped up the tent flap like shutting out the night would make any difference. He lay down again, pulling his sleeping bag around himself like he was freezing, even though the air was mild. I stayed awake until the first light seeped through the mesh, listening for any sound outside. Nothing moved except the wind lifting through the trees. When the sun finally cleared the ridge, we packed our things in silence. He didn't want to talk about what happened, and I didn't push him. The whole hike out he stayed close behind me, never drifting more than a step away. At the parking lot he told me he wasn't camping near water again, not even places he used to like. I could see in his face that the night had lodged itself somewhere deeper than just a bad sleepwalking episode. I've gone over it many times since then, trying to make sense of what I saw and heard. Sleepwalking can be complicated, and people can speak strangely when they're caught between stages of sleep. The forest can bend sound in ways that make distant noise seem close. The gap between the boulders might have shaped the wind into something that resembled a voice, and my own fear could have filled in the rest. All of that is possible, and maybe even likely. But the image that stays with me is the way he stood on that narrow ledge, balanced inches from the drop, answering something I couldn't see. Whatever explanation I settle on never feels complete, but it's the only one I have, and it keeps the memory grounded in something I can live with. I don't tell him that, of course. He already avoids lakes, rivers, even the edge of ponds. I don't think he needs any more reasons. I went car camping at a tiny, unofficial pull-off along FR 300 on the Mogollon Rim over Memorial Day weekend in 2021. It wasn't one of the marked camp spots lined with fire rings and big gravel pads. This was just a small break in the ponderosa pines, barely wide enough to back my truck in and still have room to pitch a tent. I had picked it because it sat about 100 yards from the cliff edge, close enough to feel the drop in the landscape when the wind changed direction. When I shut the engine off that afternoon, the forest seemed so open and quiet that I wondered if anyone would even notice I was there. I set my truck facing the trees, tail toward the narrow dirt track, just in case someone came down the road too fast. The tent went up behind the truck where the ground dipped a little. It felt like a good pocket of shelter, almost soundless, the way pine needles soak up noise like insulation. The air was warm and dry, and I spent the last daylight hours walking around between the trees, scanning for old fire pits or trash, so I'd have some sense of whether people used this pull-off often. I didn't see anything more than a crushed beer can and some charcoal scattered under a log. Nothing fresh. The forest road had a steady trickle of traffic earlier in the evening. People looking for spots, passing by slowly, headlights drifting between the trunks, sometimes just idling for a moment before moving on. By 10, it went dead silent. Even the wind settled, leaving the branches completely still. I tried to read for a while by lantern light in the tent, but it got too hot inside, so I switched everything off and stretched out on top of my sleeping bag. I remember thinking the silence was so complete it almost felt padded, like being underwater. Every so often a distant engine rose and faded along the rim, but nothing came close. At some point I dozed off. When I woke again, it was with that disorienting jolt you get when you're not sure where you are. I checked my watch, 12:30 a.m. I shifted onto my side and adjusted my pillow, ready to fall back asleep. That's when a faint glow cut through the tent wall, a soft, warm yellow that didn't match moonlight. It blinked once, then steadied. My brain took a second to understand what it was. The glow had the exact color of my truck's dome light. I reached down and felt my keys right where I had left them, zipped into my shorts pocket inside the sleeping bag. My chest tightened. I stayed perfectly still, listening. At first there was nothing, just the faint rustle of the tent fabric moving against my breathing. Then a sound came from the direction of the truck, small, sharp noises, plastic parts shifting, something soft sliding. It took me too long to recognize them because I didn't want to, but eventually it locked into place. Someone was going through the glove compartment. I lay there frozen, every muscle held tight enough to ache. The noises continued, papers brushing together, something being pushed aside, the dull snap of the latch hitting plastic. Whoever was there moved slowly, not in a panicked way, not like someone rummaging for valuables. It was methodical, patient, like they knew exactly how long they could take without being interrupted. The truck door clicked shut, quiet, deliberate, not the usual thump of someone careless. The interior light stayed on. I stared at the tent fabric, watching that warm glow pulse faintly with my breathing. The air inside the tent suddenly felt damp, even though it was dry outside. I strained to hear footsteps, and after a few seconds, I caught the faint crunch of pine needles. Slow steps. Approaching. Coming around the back of the truck toward the rear of my tent. The footsteps stopped right beside me, directly at the level of my head. The only barrier was a thin layer of nylon and mesh. My heartbeat was so loud I was sure it was audible through the wall of the tent. I didn't dare move. My hands were curled up at my chest, nails digging into my palms. There was a shift of weight outside, a subtle creak of the forest floor. Then a pressure descended on the tent wall. A hand, heavy and deliberate, pressed down exactly where my ear was. The nylon bowed inward, flattening across the side of my head and cheek. I stopped breathing completely. The skin of the tent was so thin I could feel the shape of fingers through it, each edge and curve distinct. The hand stayed there, steady, as if testing something, testing whether I would react. For a moment I thought I would pass out. The pressure held long enough for my mind to run through every possible outcome. I imagined the zipper moving, the tent being unzipped from the outside, the thin fabric tearing. I pictured making a run for the truck, but my keys were inside the bag with me, and even if I grabbed them fast enough, the person was between me and the driver's door. Nothing about the situation left me any option except not moving. After what felt like a full minute, but was probably only a few seconds, the pressure eased. The hand lifted away. The nylon sprang back into shape without a sound. The footsteps shifted again, 2 slow steps back, then another. I tracked them through the fabric, listening as they moved around the side of the tent and faded toward the trees. I waited. I kept waiting. I didn't breathe properly until the pine needles finally stopped crunching. Even then, I didn't unzip the tent right away. I lay flat on my back, staring up at the barely visible outline of the tent ceiling, telling myself not to panic. The interior light of the truck kept glowing through the wall, steady and silent. Every few seconds a breeze stirred the pines, and each time I thought it was footsteps returning. Eventually the tension in my legs became unbearable. I reached for my headlamp with trembling hands and quietly unzipped the tent door. The cool air hit my face so sharply it made my eyes water. I crawled out low, scanning the trees as I moved, expecting someone to step from behind a trunk. The clearing around me looked exactly as it had earlier. No shapes, no movement, just shadows layered between the pines. The truck doors were all closed. The dome light was still on, throwing a muted glow across the dashboard. I approached from the passenger side and saw the glove compartment hanging open, papers scattered across the floor mat. The registration, which I kept folded into a small envelope, was missing. Nothing else was touched. Not the phone charger, not the flashlight, not the spare keys in the center console. Just that one document. I stood there for a long time, scanning the tree-line, expecting someone to step back into the light. It felt impossible that whoever had been there could vanish so quietly. Even with the muffled ground, no one could move through that many dry needles without some trace of sound. But the forest was silent again, the same heavy quiet it had just before midnight, as if the entire encounter had been carved out of the darkness and then sealed back up. I packed in less than 5 minutes. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I shoved everything into the truck bed without folding or rolling anything. The entire time I was sure I'd hear footsteps returning, or see movement between the trees. When I finally started the engine, the sound was so loud in the still air that it startled me. I drove until I reached the paved section of the rim road. I pulled over under a street lamp near a closed visitor center, got out, and checked the glove box again, hoping I'd missed the registration in the rush. It wasn't there. The empty space where it should have been felt more disturbing than if someone had taken everything. A single document with my name, address, and plate number, taken by someone who had stood inches from my face in the dark. I filed a report the next day in Payson. The officer said people sometimes steal registrations to check if a vehicle is a good target to come back for, or to match plates for something illegal. No one ever used mine, and nothing ever happened with it. But the officer also said something that stuck with me. Someone had gone through my truck while I was asleep, and then walked over to my tent without any hesitation. That kind of person wasn't looking for an opportunistic theft. That kind of person was comfortable being that close to a stranger in the dark. I've camped plenty since then, but never again in an unmarked pull-off. Never again where headlights can't be seen from the road. Sometimes I still think about the weight of that hand on the tent wall, how it pressed down so gently, almost like someone checking whether a shape beneath fabric was real.